Summer 1878. Onyx Ridge, Texas. "You're not the woman I hired," Harlan Caldwell said. His eyes locked on Evangeline. She lifted her chin despite the fear in her eyes. "I boarded the wrong wagon. Because if I'd stayed, they'd have sold me to Thaddeus Montgomery." Before either of them could speak again, an arrow slammed into the cabin door with a note tied to it. "Bring the woman and the land deeds, or the boy dies." Harlan's jaw tightened as he reached for his rifle. Then Montgomery just signed his own death warrant. One wrong wagon changed 2 lives forever. But can they save the ranch before it's too late? Stay with me, because this story is just getting started. The stagecoach hit a rut, and Evangeline Sterling bit down on her tongue hard enough to taste blood. She pressed her back against the wooden seat and kept her eyes on the floor. 3 other passengers shared the coach with her. A traveling merchant, a reverend with mud on his boots, a woman in a yellow dress who hadn't stopped talking since Abilene. Evangeline didn't hear a word any of them said. Her mind was running calculations. Distance traveled, miles left, whether the man her uncle had sent was still behind her or somewhere ahead. She had made her decision 4 days ago in a parlor that smelled like pipe smoke and old money. Her uncle had smiled at her across the desk, that thin, practiced smile, and explained her situation calmly, like a business arrangement, like she was a parcel to be rerouted. She had smiled back, nodded, then walked upstairs, packed 1 bag, and climbed out the window before supper was on the table. 4 days. She had been running for 4 days. The coach lurched again, and through the small window, she caught her first look at Onyx Ridge. It was uglier than she expected. The main street was a wide, sun-bleached stretch of packed earth that the wind was doing its best to carry away 1 grain at a time. Buildings lined both sides a saloon, a land office, a dry goods store, a sheriff's post with a broken shutter banging in the breeze. The whole town sat under a layer of pale dust like a thin coat of ash. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the post office, and the driver called out arrival. Evangeline stepped down last. She kept her hat low and scanned the platform without lifting her chin. There, on the far left, a broad-shouldered man in a black vest standing beside a post, turning a coin slowly between his fingers. He had a scar that ran jaw to brow on the left side of his face. She had never seen the man before in her life, but she recognized the stillness in him. Men who worked for her uncle had that same kind of stillness, the kind that meant they were being paid to wait. She turned away before he could meet her eyes. "Think, walk slowly, don't run." There were 4 wagons lined up along the post office rail. 2 were laden with supply crates. 1 had a woman climbing up to the seat beside the driver. The last one sat apart from the others, a plain flatbed, with a young boy holding the reins, maybe 16 years old, leaning back and chewing on a piece of dried grass. Evangeline walked toward it. She kept her pace even, unhurried, her bag in one hand, her ticket stub in the other for appearances. When she reached the wagon, she looked up at the boy with calm, steady eyes. "Is this the Caldwell wagon?" The boy straightened up. "Yes, ma'am." She climbed up before he could say another word. She didn't know the name Caldwell. She didn't know what or who she was riding toward. But behind her, the man in the black vest had pushed off the post and was walking slowly along the platform, scanning faces. She tucked herself low on the bench seat and kept her eyes forward. The boy finished his grass stem and flicked it into the dirt. "You're earlier than we figured," he said. "Long journey," she said simply. He nodded and clicked his tongue at the horse. The wagon rolled. Evangeline exhaled for what felt like the first time all morning. She was 2 blocks down the main street when she heard it, a sound that wasn't the wind and wasn't the creak of the wagon. Something flat and ugly, a grunt, then a short cry, quickly cut off. The boy pulled the reins without being asked. He had heard it too. Between the land office and a boarded-up building, 3 men had a boy backed against the wall. The boy couldn't have been more than 12. His lip was split. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. One of the men had him by the collar and was saying something low and mean that Evangeline couldn't make out. She started to stand up on the wagon seat. She didn't have a plan. She had an instinct. Then she stopped, because someone else was already moving. He came out of the general store across the street, tall, wide across the shoulders, in the way that came from actual work, not posturing. A Stetson shadowed his face. He carried a Winchester rifle loose at his side, more out of habit than threat. He crossed the street without hurrying. The three men didn't notice him until he was already there. The one holding the boy turned, started to say something, probably a warning, probably something about minding his own business. The man with the Stetson swung the butt of the Winchester once, clean and fast. The man dropped. The second one came forward and caught the same treatment before he'd taken 2 steps. The third one looked at his companions on the ground, then looked at the man standing over them, then turned and walked quickly in the opposite direction. No words, no warning, no speech about right or wrong. The man in the Stetson crouched down beside the boy, said something quiet. The boy nodded and stood up slowly, touching his lip with the back of his hand. Then the man stood, adjusted the rifle under his arm, and looked up at the wagon. His eyes found Evangeline. Even across the distance, she could see the scar. It ran down the left side of his face from somewhere above his brow to the edge of his jaw, pale against weathered skin. He was 30-something, or maybe the years had just settled on him harder than they should have. His eyes were dark and steady, and they looked at her with no particular expression she could read. He walked to the wagon, looked at the boy holding the reins, then back at her. "This her?" he asked. "Yes, sir," the boy said. "Arrived on the morning stage." The man said nothing for a moment. He studied her the way someone studies a letter they're not sure they want to open. Then he walked to the front of the wagon and climbed up on the driver's side in a single motion, settling in beside her without ceremony. He was close, larger up close. She could smell dust and leather and something like machine oil. He took the reins from the boy, who hopped up into the wagon bed behind them. "Harlan Caldwell," he said. Not an introduction. Exactly. Just a name placed into the air between them. "Evangeline Sterling," she said. He clicked his tongue, and the horse moved. They rode out of Onyx Ridge in silence. The main street fell behind them. The buildings thinned. The land opened up wide and flat in every direction, broken only by scrub brush and distant rock. The sky was immense out here, pale blue at the top, the color of fired clay near the horizon. She watched the land pass and worked on steadying her breathing. She had boarded the wrong wagon. She understood that now with complete clarity. She had no idea who Harlan Caldwell was, or what he had been expecting this morning, or what waited for her at the end of this road. But she had also just watched a man put 2 people on the ground without a word spoken, without any show of anger, and then crouched down to check on a bruised child. Like it was the most ordinary sequence of events in the world. Like protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves was simply the next thing on his list. She had grown up around powerful men. Her father, her uncle, men who used their power to take, who leaned on other people like furniture. This man had used his without taking anything. She glanced sideways at him. He was watching the road, one hand loose on the reins, the other resting on his knee. The Winchester lay across the floorboard at their feet. "The boy," she said. "Do you know him?" "He works at the feed store," Harlan said. "Has for about a year." "Do those men bother him often?" "They won't anymore." That was the end of it, as far as he was concerned. He didn't explain further. He didn't look for her reaction. Evangeline faced the road again. The wagon rolled on. The dust rose and settled behind them. Ahead, somewhere past the ridge, was a ranch called the Promised Land, a name that could mean everything or nothing at all, depending on what you'd been promised and by whom. She didn't know yet which one it would be for her, but she was starting to suspect it wasn't going to be simple. The Promised Land didn't look like much from the road. A main house, 2 stories, built from timber that had gone dark with age and weather. A long bunkhouse running parallel to the barn. A smokehouse. A chicken run. A garden plot behind the house where someone had been working the soil. Recently, the turned earth was still dark with moisture. But what struck Evangeline first wasn't the buildings. It was the people. 3 men were splitting wood near the barn. One was white, broad and red-faced from the sun. One was black, older, moving with the ease of someone who'd done this same work 10,000 times. The third was native, younger, his long dark hair tied back, watching the wagon pull in with quiet, careful eyes. A woman came out of the main house, wiping her hands on an apron. Mexican, maybe 40, with silver threading through her black hair, and a face that gave nothing away for free. Rosa, Harlan said as the wagon stopped. "We've got a guest." Rosa looked at Evangeline, then at Harlan, then back at Evangeline. Whatever question she had, she kept it behind her teeth. "Supper's in an hour," she said, and went back inside. Harlan climbed down and walked toward the barn without another word. The boy, his name was Cody. Evangeline had learned on the ride, grabbed her bag from the wagon bed and carried it to the porch without being asked. Evangeline stood in the yard for a moment. Everyone had gone back to their work. The wood splitting resumed. A dog crossed the yard from shade to shade. Somewhere in the barn, a horse stamped. No one stared at her. No one came forward to introduce themselves. It wasn't unfriendly exactly. It was just efficient, like a place that ran on a rhythm and didn't break stride for interruptions. She picked up her skirt and walked up the porch steps. The inside of the house was plain but clean. A stone fireplace on the main wall. A long table running through the center of the room, big enough to seat 10. Shelves of dry goods, hanging herbs, a rifle above the door. A bookshelf near the window with more volumes on it than she had expected. She stood at the bookshelf and read The Spines while Rosa moved through the kitchen without looking at her. Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, a worn Bible, 3 volumes of land surveying, a medical reference book from 1867, 2 novels, both dog-eared. One was Jane Eyre. She almost smiled at that. "You read?" Rosa said behind her. Evangeline turned. "Yes, do you?" Rosa looked at her evenly. "I'm teaching myself," she said, and turned back to the stove. Evangeline set her bag down near the bookshelf. "I could help with that," she said, "if you wanted." Rosa didn't answer immediately. She stirred something in the pot, tasted it, added a pinch of something from a small jar. Then she said, without turning around, "We'll see." Supper came together fast. Pork stew with cornbread, a pot of black coffee. Rosa moved through the kitchen with an efficiency that was almost choreography. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. The men came in from outside as the light changed. Boots on the porch steps, the sound of water being poured from the pump, hands being dried. They filed in through the door one by one. Evangeline sat at the far end of the table and watched it happen. The older black man, Thomas, she would learn, sat down at the bench without ceremony and reached for the bread. The young native man, Luca, sat across from him and poured himself coffee. Then the 2 white ranch hands came in. Burl, the red-faced one, and a younger man named Pete, who had pale eyes and a nervous habit of touching the brim of his hat even when he wasn't wearing it. Burl stopped at the edge of the table. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Luca. He looked at the bread already in Thomas's hand, and something shifted in his face, a tightening around the jaw, a slight flare of the nose. "I'll eat on the porch," Burl said. Pete hovered behind him like a shadow without a decision of its own. Harlan came through the door. He hadn't cleaned up beyond washing his hands and face. His hair was still pushed back where the hat had pressed it. He moved to the head of the table, set his hat on the peg by the door, and pulled out his chair. Then he stopped. He looked at Burl, at the porch, at Pete hovering behind him. He reached to the center of the table, picked up the loaf of bread Rosa had just set down, and placed it back in front of Thomas and Luca. Then he reached to his belt, drew his hunting knife, and drove it into the table with a single, flat crack of sound that silenced everything. The blade stood upright, quivering slightly. "Whoever bleeds for this ranch," Harlan said, "earns the right to eat here." He sat down. He picked up his spoon and started eating. Bullets flying out there. "Don't stop to ask about a man's bloodline." He set it to his bowl. Calm, almost conversational. "If that arrangement doesn't suit you, the road's right where you left it." Burl stood very still for a long moment. Thomas kept eating. Luca wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Rosa came out of the kitchen with another bowl and set it at an empty seat like nothing of consequence had just occurred. Burl pulled out the chair beside Pete and sat down. He didn't say anything. He picked up his spoon. He ate. Pete sat down next to him, reached for the bread with a hand that wasn't quite steady, and tore off a piece. Evangeline had not moved since the knife came out. She sat very still and looked at Harlan Caldwell eating his supper at the head of his table. No sermon, no anger, no righteousness in his voice, not even a trace of it. He had stated a fact and returned to his food. She had studied political philosophy at her finishing school in Boston. She had read arguments about human equality that ran on for pages, footnoted and carefully structured. She had heard speeches in parlors full of people who agreed with each other. She had never seen anything like what just happened. After supper, she helped Rosa carry the bowls to the kitchen. Thomas had taken a slash across the back of his right hand sometime during the day. Barbed wire, he said when she asked. Indifferent to it, the way men who worked with their hands were indifferent to small damage. But the cut needed cleaning. She had seen infections start from less. She went to her bag and came back with a small kit she had packed carefully before she climbed out that Boston window. Needle, thread, clean cotton, a bottle of carbolic solution. Thomas watched her unpack it without expression. "You're a doctor," he said. "No, my mother was." She uncapped the carbolic. She believed a woman should know how to do useful things. He submitted to it without complaint. Didn't flinch when the carbolic went on, though it had to sting. While she worked, Luca leaned against the kitchen doorframe and watched. After a moment, he held up his left forearm, where a long scrape had gone red along the edges. She cleaned that too. Burl was sitting near the fireplace, pretending to read a 3-day-old newspaper. She walked over to him when she was done with Luca. He looked up at her, wary. Something on the edge of embarrassment, under the wariness. "I noticed you favoring your left wrist at the table," she said. A silence. "Rolled it yesterday," he said finally. "Ain't nothing. Let me see." He hesitated. Then he held out his wrist. She pressed along the joint carefully. He winced once. Not broken, sprained. Mildly, the kind of thing a few days of light wrapping would settle. She wrapped it with a length of cotton and tied it off neatly. He stared at the wrapped wrist for a moment. "Thank you," he said, like the word cost him something. "Of course," she said, and went back to the kitchen to clean her instruments. She was drying the needle when she became aware of Harlan standing in the kitchen doorway. He was watching her, not with suspicion this time, something quieter than that. "Where'd you train?" he asked. "My mother," she said again. "She was a nurse during the war. She kept notes. I read them." He was quiet a moment. "That's useful out here, I gathered." She capped the carbolic. "Is there a doctor in Onyx Ridge?" There was. He pushed off the doorframe. "He left 2 years ago." She understood what he didn't say. "Then there isn't one." "No," he said, "there isn't." He went back down the hall. She heard the front door open and close, checking the property one last time before dark. She suspected. The kind of habit a man developed when he had things worth protecting and reason to believe someone might want to take them. She dried her hands and stood at the kitchen window. The land outside was going dark at the edges, the sky still faintly orange above the tree line. Far away, a coyote made its sound and was answered by another. Rosa came and stood beside her at the window without saying anything. After a while, Rosa said, "Whoever you are, whatever brought you here." She kept her eyes on the darkening yard. "You treated those men like people." Evangeline waited. "Burl has never had a woman look at his wrist like his pain was worth her time." Rosa said it flatly, without sentiment. "It matters, even when they don't say so." Evangeline looked at the last stripe of orange on the horizon. "My mother told me," she said quietly, "that the fastest way to change a room is to treat the person being ignored like they're the most important one in it." Rosa made a small sound, not quite a laugh. Something between agreement and acknowledgement. "Sharp woman," Rosa said. She was, Evangeline said. Yes. The coyote called once more, and the night came fully in. She had been there 6 days when Harlan found the papers. It was early morning. Evangeline was in the garden with Rosa, learning which plants needed water and which ones needed to be left alone. The soil here was different from anything she'd worked in Boston. Harder, drier, giving things up reluctantly. But Rosa said it was good land underneath, if you were patient with it. She didn't hear him come out of the house. She heard the door. She turned, and he was standing on the porch steps with the leather satchel in his hand. Her satchel. He had the papers out. The ones from the stagecoach company. The ones that named the passenger, expected to arrive, on the morning coach from Abilene. He wasn't looking at the papers anymore. He was looking at her. She straightened up, let her hands fall to her sides. Didn't run, because there was nowhere to run to. He came down the steps and crossed the yard and stopped about 4 feet from her. Rosa had gone very still with her hand in the dirt. Her name was Clara Booth, he said. He held up the papers. She was 22, from San Antonio. She was supposed to bring references from a schoolmaster and a reverend. Evangeline held his eyes. I know, you're not her. No, you didn't come from San Antonio. No. He looked at the papers once more. Then he folded them in half and held them down at his side. Then who sent for you? He said. It wasn't exactly a question. No one, she said. I boarded the wrong wagon. A long pause. You boarded the wrong wagon, he repeated. I was trying to get away from someone. I didn't have time to check where the wagon was going. I sat down and it moved and she paused. I let it. He studied her face the way he had that first moment on the street, the same reading a letter look, looking for the part that was untrue. Who are you running from? He said. She told him. Not everything, but enough. Her uncle, the debt, the man in the black vest she had spotted at the station platform. The name, Thaddeus Montgomery, which made something shift in Harlan's expression that she filed away carefully. When she was done, the yard was quiet except for the chickens and the wind. I'll pay you for the time, she said. I have some money, not much, but keep your money, he said. Then I'll work. I can cook. I can teach. I can treat medical cases. I know what you can do, he said. I've been watching you for 6 days. She stopped. He looked out at the fence line, then back at her. You stay, he said, on 2 conditions. She waited. Separate rooms, he said. That's not negotiable. Of course, she said. And you don't go into Onyx Ridge without someone from this ranch beside you. Not until I know how far Montgomery's reach goes. She thought about the man in the black vest. The practiced stillness in him. Agreed, she said. He nodded once and walked back toward the barn. Rosa picked up her trowel and went back to the dirt, like the conversation had been about weather. Evangeline stood in the garden for a moment, with the sun on her back, and slowly let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She stayed. She kept her room. Harlan kept his at the far end of the hall. The house had a rhythm that she worked herself into gradually, like learning the steps to a dance nobody described out loud. Rosa was up before the sun. Cody fed the horses before breakfast. Thomas and Luca were in the fields by the time the coffee was done. Harlan was everywhere: fence line, barn, bunkhouse, fields moving through the property in a circuit that never seemed to fully end. She learned to be useful before she was asked. She reorganized the medical supplies and made a written inventory. She cataloged what they were short on and what they had in excess. She started working through the land records. Harlan kept in a box under the desk a disorganized collection of deeds and survey maps and county correspondence, and began putting them into a clear order with dates and notes in the margins. He came in one evening and found her at the desk with the lamp burning and 3 neat stacks where there had been one chaotic pile. He looked at the stacks. He looked at her. I haven't touched anything, she said. I only organized. Nothing is missing. He picked up the top paper from the nearest stack. Read it. Set it back. It's been like that for 2 years, he said. I can see that. She kept her voice neutral. He made a sound that might have been the beginning of a word and decided against it, and left the room. She took it as a yes. On the 9th day, he took her out to the backfield with the rifles. He didn't explain why. He came to the kitchen in the morning and said, "Come outside when you're done with that," and pointed at the biscuits she was taking out of the oven. She handed the tray to Rosa and followed him. There were 2 rifles laid over the fence rail, a Winchester, his, and a smaller carbine that she guessed had belonged to someone before it ended up here. He handed her the carbine. She took it. She had held a rifle before her father's, once when she was 12, but not since. Hold it like a tool, he said, not like something you're afraid of. She adjusted her grip. He walked around behind her. She was aware of him before she felt his presence. The air changed slightly. Her back tensed. Every time a man had come up behind her in the past 2 years, it had meant something she didn't want to remember. But he stopped. She could feel the warmth of him at her back, close but not touching. He spoke beside her ear. Left elbow needs to come down, he said. She lowered it. There, a pause. Sightline runs straight back from your eye to the rear notch to the front post. Everything in one line. She found the line. The fence post at the far end of the field jumped into sharp focus. When you're ready, he said, exhale slow and squeeze. Don't pull. She exhaled. She squeezed. The shot cracked out across the field, and the fence post about 30 yards out showed a white scar of new wood just left of center. Again, he said. He stayed behind her, not touching, just present. She became very aware of specific things, the heat radiating from his chest through the thin morning air, the sound of his breathing, which was slower and deeper than hers, the particular steadiness of him. Men who moved through the world at Harlan Caldwell's temperature were rare. She had met men who performed calm. He didn't perform anything. She fired again. Closer this time. He said nothing, which she had already learned meant better. They did this for an hour. By the end, she was hitting the post consistently. Her hands had stopped shaking after the third shot. When she lowered the rifle, her arms were tired, and her ears were ringing slightly, and something in her chest that had been tightly wound for a very long time had loosened a fraction. She turned around. He was already reaching for his Winchester on the rail. Business done. Moving on to the next thing on his list. Why are you doing this? She said. He looked up. Teaching me, she said. He held the Winchester in both hands, considering the question like it deserved actual consideration. Because Montgomery doesn't stop, he said simply, and this ranch has women on it. He set the Winchester over his shoulder and walked back toward the fence line. She looked at the scarred post at the far end of the field. She raised the carbine one more time, without being asked. Sighted carefully, exhaled slow, squeezed dead center. She lowered the rifle and walked back to the house to help Rosa with the noon meal. In the evenings, Hun would sometimes sit on the porch with coffee, and she would sit in the chair at the other end with a book, and they would not talk, which was its own kind of conversation. She had grown up in houses full of noise people performing their pleasantness at each other. This silence was different. It was inhabited, comfortable, in a way that surprised her every time she noticed it. One evening, she looked up from her book and found him watching her. He looked back at his coffee without any embarrassment about being caught. She thought about asking him something. She had a list of things she wanted to understand about this place, and the man running it. She let them sit. Some things reveal themselves on their own time, her mother used to say. Push too hard, and you close the door. She went back to her book. He went back to his coffee. The night came in easy, and the coyotes called across the dark hills, and the ranch breathed in and out like a living thing, which is exactly what it was. Thomas found the first dead cattle on a Tuesday. 2 steers, both shot clean through at the waterhole in the north pasture. No spent shells left behind. No tracks the ground was dry enough to hold clearly. Just the animals and the flies and the hot, flat silence of the pasture. Harlan crouched beside the nearer one for a long moment. He put 2 fingers to the wound, looked at the angle. Shot from the ridge, he said to Thomas, at least 400 yards. Thomas stood with his hat in his hands. That's a deliberate shot. Boss, deliberate aim. I know it. The water troughs were next. Rosa noticed it 2 mornings later. She came back from filling the kitchen bucket and said, quietly, that the water tasted of something it shouldn't. Harlan pulled up a full bucket and smelled it. He said one word under his breath that Evangeline didn't catch and poured the bucket out on the ground. He went into Onyx Ridge that afternoon, alone. He came back in the evening and sat at the kitchen table and told them what he'd been able to piece together. Thaddeus Montgomery had approached 3 of the neighboring ranchers in the past month about selling. 2 of them had declined. One of them had already left his place, sitting empty. The story in town being that he had family trouble back east that needed seeing to. But his horse was still in the stable when he left, and a man with family trouble takes his horse. Harlan placed his hands flat on the table. "He's moving," Harlan said, "and we're in his way." Thomas crossed his arms. Luca looked at his boots. Burl, to his credit, looked at Harlan and asked, "What do we do?" "We stay ready," Harlan said. "We fix the water line to the south trough. It's cleaner from that source. We watch the ridge at night, 2-hour rotations. Nobody goes out alone." He looked around the table. "This is what I know," he said. "We have legal deed to this property. Every inch of it properly surveyed and registered in the county record. If we hold ground and keep our heads, the law is on our side." Evangeline had been listening from the kitchen doorway. She thought about the box of land records she had organized, the survey maps, the correspondence from the county office. She thought about 3 years of law and property books on that shelf. She stored the thought and said nothing yet. The night watches started that same evening. Harlan took the first rotation himself, which nobody argued with. Thomas took the second. Luca the third. Cody wanted to participate, and Harlan told him he could help by being sharp-eyed during the day and getting proper sleep at night. Cody looked like he wanted to debate this, and then looked at Harlan's face and decided against it. On the fourth night, Evangeline came out at midnight with 2 cups of coffee. Thomas was finishing his rotation on the porch. He took the coffee with a nod, and they stood in the dark together for a moment. "How long has Harlan owned this land?" she asked. Thomas turned his cup in his hands. "He bought the first parcel 9 years ago, 200 acres. A pause. Added the north section 3 years after that. Then the creek land 2 years back. He built it from nothing," she said. "From less than nothing," Thomas said. He looked out at the dark field. "When he first came here, half the town tried to run him off. A man his age, alone, with more scars than references. People make assumptions." He drank his coffee. Then they saw how he ran the place, who he gave work to, who he protected. He paused again. "People still make assumptions, but they make them quieter now." She thought about that. "And Montgomery," she said. "Montgomery came about 4 years ago. Railroad money, people say, or behind it. He bought the old Reyes land cheap and fast. Then the Hutchins place. Then the old feed mill." Thomas's jaw tightened slightly. Things don't disappear when Montgomery buys them. They just start serving his purposes instead. The night was very still. Far out across the dark land, something moved through the brush, an animal. Probably, though, the sound made the hairs on her forearms stand up. "Get some sleep," Thomas said, not unkindly. "We'll need everyone clear-eyed tomorrow." She went in. She lay on her bed in the dark, with her hands folded on her stomach, and stared at the ceiling. She thought about legal documents and county records in U.S. Martial jurisdiction. She had read enough of her father's law books before everything went wrong, before the money ran out, and the uncle arrived to know that land cases had patterns. Harassment, coercion, paper manipulation. They followed a sequence. She thought about Montgomery and her uncle meeting somewhere, shaking hands, dividing things up between them. She thought about herself as one of those things being divided. She closed her eyes and made a decision. The next morning, she asked Harlan if she could write letters on his behalf using his paper and ink. He looked at her for a moment and then said, "Depends on who you're writing." "The U.S. Marshal in Reeves County," she said, "and the County Land Registry in Austin." He was quiet. "I've looked at your deed records," she said carefully. "Everything you hold is legitimate. But if Montgomery is planning to challenge your title or manufacture a dispute, you want to have already been in correspondence with the people who can verify it. You want a paper trail that shows you were acting in good faith before any conflict officially begins." He looked at her like he was revising something. "You learned all this from books," he said. "From books and from watching careful people," she said. "Yes." A pause. "Write the letters," he said. She wrote them that afternoon at the desk, in the lamplit study. 3 pages to the marshal and 2 to the county registry, laying out the property history clearly and requesting written confirmation of the legal record on file. She wrote them in clean, Precise language, no hysteria. No accusations. Just documented facts and courteous requests. She sealed them and gave them to Harlan, and he looked at them for a moment. "You write like a lawyer," he said. "My father wanted a son," she said simply. "He got me," instead, and decided to make the best of it. She saw something move across his face that was brief and complicated, and was gone before she could identify it. 3 nights later, they cut the barbed wire. Luca found it on his dawn walk of the perimeter, a 50-foot section of the east fence laid flat, the posts pulled, and the wire unrolled carefully, so it would look from a distance like the fence was intact. The cattle in the east pasture had already started to drift. Evangeline was out in the yard when Harlan came back from the perimeter at a hard walk, Luca behind him. She saw his expression and said nothing. She went to the barn and brought out the wire tools without being asked and handed them to Thomas, who was already pulling on his gloves. They spent the morning restringing the east line. That night, Evangeline went upstairs after supper and changed. She had been thinking about it for a few days. Her Eastern dresses were wrong out here, wrong in every possible sense. They restricted her movement. They caught on every fence and branch. And they announced her as someone who didn't belong in this landscape. Someone who needed protecting. She didn't want to need protecting. Not in that way. She had seen an old pair of trousers in the storage room that looked like they had belonged to a younger or smaller hand. She had taken them quietly 2 days ago and spent her evenings letting them out at the hip and shortening the legs. She had a work shirt of Rosa's that Rosa had handed over without being asked, as if she had been waiting. She came downstairs in the trousers and the work shirt with her hair tied back. Rosa looked up from the stove, looked her up and down once, and said, "Better." Harlan came in from the yard. He looked at her, said nothing, went to the pump. Burl opened his mouth, Thomas said, without looking up from the harness he was mending. Burl closed his mouth. Evangeline loaded her carbine at the kitchen table, checked the sight, and set it by the door. She took the midnight watch herself. She stood on the dark porch in the warm summer night. The carbine rested across her forearm and watched the fence line the way Harlan had taught her. Scan slowly. Stop when something doesn't look right. Trust your peripheral vision more than your center gaze in the dark. She heard Harlan's boots on the porch at the hour change. He stopped beside her, looked at the fence line, looked at her. "Quiet," she said. "Always is before it isn't," he said. He went to the left side of the porch. She stayed on the right. They stood in the dark and watched together. After a long while, he said, "Quietly, you don't have to do this." "I know," she said. "You're not a ranch hand." "No," she said. "But it's my life they're threatening too." She kept her eyes on the field. "I don't sit in rooms while people fight for my life. I never have a pause. I just never had the tools before." He was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you grow up?" he said. It was the first personal thing he had asked her. "Boston," she said. "We had a townhouse on Beacon Hill. My father was a lawyer. My mother kept the household and raised 3 children and managed my father's correspondence and kept his books and had strong opinions about justice that she was very careful to express only in rooms where women were allowed to have them." She paused. "They both died in '74. Fever. My brother 2 years after, same fever. Different season." "I'm sorry," he said. "Then my uncle arrived," she said, "and the rest you know." He was quiet again. The night pressed in around them. "I grew up in Tennessee," he said then. She waited. "My family had land." His voice was level and quiet. 100 acres. Good soil. My father was a decent man who trusted the wrong people." He stopped. She didn't push. She just stood in the dark. He said, after a moment, "There are men who build things, and there are men who take what other men built." He looked out at the fence line. "I swore I'd never lose land again, whatever it cost." He touched the brim of his hat. Once a gesture that in him seemed to mean something was finished, and went inside. She stood on the porch and breathed the dark Texas air and understood something about Harlan Caldwell that no paperwork could have told her. This land wasn't just property to him. It was the answer to a question that had been eating at him since Tennessee. It was proof that he could be the man who built things and kept them. that what he made could last. She held the carbine and watched the fence line and understood, completely, why he would die before he let Thaddeus Montgomery take an inch of it. She was starting to understand, slow and certain as water finding its level, that she would too. The sky turned wrong 2 days before the storm hit. Evangeline noticed it first. She had grown up on the Atlantic coast, where weather came in off the water with visible intention. And she had learned early to read clouds the way some people read faces. The ones building to the southwest that Wednesday evening were not ordinary thunderheads. They were massive and dark at the base, and moving with a slow, deliberate weight that made her stand still in the yard and watch them until Rosa called her in for supper. She mentioned it at the table. Thomas nodded. "I smelled it this morning," he said. "Soil's been dry 2 months. When it breaks, it's going to break hard." Harlan looked at the window. How long, Thomas thought. Tomorrow night. Maybe the night after. Harlan was quiet through the rest of the meal. Evangeline watched him working something through behind his eyes. Not worry exactly, something more like calculation. When they cleared the plates, he went outside and walked the perimeter alone in the last of the daylight. She stood on the porch and watched him move along the fence line, stopping here and there, looking at the ground, looking at the sky. He came back in and told Thomas to move the yearlings from the north pasture to the south pen in the morning. He told Luca to check every gate latch and every fence post along the creek bank. He told Cody to fill every available barrel with water from the clean south trough before the storm hit, because what fell from this kind of sky came down dirty. He looked at Evangeline last. "Keep your carbine loaded and close," he said. She had been keeping it that way for 2 weeks. She just nodded. The storm came Thursday night. It started as distant rumbling that she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. By midnight, the lightning was close enough that the whole yard lit up white every few minutes, sharp and flat, like a photographer's flash. By 1 in the morning, the rain came. It didn't start slow. It arrived all at once, straight down and furious, hammering the roof so hard that conversation inside the house required raising your voice. Rosa moved through the kitchen by lamplight, her face calm and practiced. Luca and Thomas were in the bunkhouse. Burl and Pete were playing cards at the bunkhouse table, though the cards were largely ignored. Harlan was on the porch. Evangeline pulled on her oilskin coat. She had purchased it 2 weeks ago in preparation, because she was learning to think in practical terms now, and went out to stand beside him. The ranch yard was already running with water. The soil couldn't absorb it fast enough. In the lantern light, the puddles were spreading and connecting, turning the yard into a shallow, moving sheet. "The north pasture," she said. "The yearlings are in the south pen." "Since morning," he said. Thomas made sure. Lightning cracked directly overhead, and for a moment everything was white and shadowless, and she could see every detail of his face, jaw tight, eyes scanning the dark beyond the fence. Rain running off the brim of his hat in a steady pour. Then the sound reached them. It came from the north, low at first, below the rain noise, like a vibration more than a sound, then louder. Then the distinctive percussion of 1,000 hooves on soaked ground. They both recognized it at the same moment. "That's a stampede," she said. He was already off the porch. He hit the yard at a run, and she was 2 steps behind him. He didn't tell her to stay back. She wouldn't have anyway, and she believed. In that moment, he knew it. "Thomas." He raised his voice against the rain, and Thomas was already out of the bunkhouse, already running toward the barn. Luca behind him. The horses were saddled in 4 minutes, she was counting, and Cody appeared from somewhere and tried to get to a horse. And Harlan pointed at him with absolute authority and said House and Cody stopped. They rode out into the rain. It was a different world out there. The dark was total between the lightning flashes, and the rain was cold and horizontal now, driven sideways by a wind that had come up fast from the southwest. The ground was soft and treacherous, and her horse, a steady roan mare named Clover, that Harlan had assigned to her a week ago, moved carefully, but kept her footing. The herd was coming from the north. That made no sense unless the north fence had been cut. She thought it through as she rode. 2 months of pressure from Montgomery's men. the wire cutting, the water, the dead cattle, all of it probing and prodding. And now a storm, and in the cover of the storm, someone had cut the north fence and run the cattle, not their cattle, cattle from somewhere else. A bigger herd down toward the Caldwell Ranch. A stampede aimed like a weapon. She caught up to Harlan on the ridge and yelled it over the wind. He turned and looked at her, and she could see in the next lightning flash that he had already reached the same conclusion. "Can we divert them?" she called. "There's a draw to the east," he called back. "If we can push the lead animals left, the rest will follow. It's instinct. How many men do we need on the left flank?" "All of us on that side," he said, firing in the air. Enough noise to turn them. They split. Thomas and Luca went wide left. Harlan took the center. She positioned herself on the far left edge, where she could see the leading edge of the herd beginning to resolve out of the dark. A moving darkness within the darkness. A sound that was now filling the entire night. She raised the carbine in the air and fired. The sound cracked out and was immediately swallowed by the thunder. She worked the lever and fired again and again. Beside her, Thomas was firing and shouting and waving his hat in wide arcs, and the lead animals veered, just slightly, to the right. More firing, more noise. Luca, she had never heard before, some combination of a shout and a call that cut through even the storm, and the herd shifted. It was working. Then Clover's left foreleg went into soft ground, and the world tipped. It happened fast, the way bad things do. The horse caught herself, didn't fall, but lurched sideways, and Evangeline was not prepared for the sideways, and she came off the saddle. She hit the wet ground hard on her left side, her breath gone, her hat gone, rain on her face, and the thunder directly overhead, and the sound of the herd still coming. She got up. She got her bearings. She saw the draw of the river, 20 feet to her left. She had not realized she was that close, and she saw that the bank was already overflowing. She took one step toward Clover, and the ground gave way. It wasn't a fall. Exactly. The bank simply wasn't there anymore. The rain had been undermining it, and her weight was the last thing it needed, and the muddy edge crumbled, and she was in the river before she could do anything at all. The cold hit her like a wall. The current was violent. Not deep, maybe chest deep, but fast and loaded with debris. Silt uprooted brush, all of it moving together in the dark. She got her feet under her and tried to stand, and the current knocked her sideways before she found the bottom. She heard Harlan's voice. She couldn't make out the word. She heard her name in it, or something that contained her name. And then the thunder took everything. She grabbed a root that came past her. It held for 3 seconds, and then tore loose, and she went with the current. She was not panicking. She was solving. Her mother had taught her to swim in the Atlantic, really swim, not the decorative paddling that finishing schools taught, and she used that now, working with the current instead of against it, angling toward the far bank, which was slightly less dark than the water. Her hand found something solid, a boulder, half submerged. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it. She held on with both hands while the river pulled at her legs. She heard him before she saw him. The splash of someone in the water upstream, moving fast. And then Harlan was there. He had his arm around her before she could process the sequence of how he'd gotten there. His grip was absolute, no give in it whatsoever. The arm of a man who was not releasing what he was holding under any circumstances. "I've got you," he said, directly against her ear. And then the darkness came all the way down. She didn't lose consciousness. It was more like the world narrowed to a single point, Harlan's arm. The cold, the sound of the river, and then that narrowed to nothing. When it came back cold and slow. The ground under her was mud. The rain was still falling, but less violent now. Or maybe that was only her perception. She was on her back on the riverbank. Harlan was kneeling beside her in the mud. He had his hand under her head. He looked at her face, and when her eyes opened and found his face, something shifted in him that he didn't bother hiding. Relief, raw and unguarded. She had never seen his face do anything without his permission before. "Can you move?" he said. She tested her arms, her legs. Everything answered, slowly and painfully. "Yes," she said. He got her upright. She leaned on him and didn't apologize for it. He was soaking and cold as she was. His hat gone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and he was already scanning the far bank, the ridge, the dark, the herd, she said. Thomas and Luca turned them, he said. It's done. She nodded. He looked at her, again, carefully. The way he had looked at the land survey maps, checking for damage. There's a line cabin, he said. Quarter-mile up the ridge. We need to get off this bank before it floods further. I can walk, she said. I know you can, he said. Come on. They went up the ridge together into the dark. The cabin was small and dark and smelled of old wood and dust. Something underneath that was just barely warm, the remnant of a fire someone had built weeks or months ago. Harlan got the door open and got her inside, and then spent 30 seconds finding the lantern and the matches, which were kept in a tin box on the mantel, above the small stone fireplace. His hands were steady. She noticed that. Her own were shaking enough that she pressed them together and breathed carefully. The lantern caught, and the cabin emerged from the dark. One room, a stone fireplace at the north wall, a wood frame cot against the east wall with no mattress on it, just the rope lacing, a shelf with a few tins of food, a stack of split wood in the corner, dry, because whoever had built the last fire had the sense to fill it. One wool blanket, folded on the shelf. Harlan went immediately to the fireplace. He had a fire going in 3 minutes, careful and competent. The fire of a man who had done it in worse conditions than these. The light and the heat began slowly, then built. Evangeline stood in the middle of the room and understood the situation with clinical clarity. They were both soaking wet through every layer. The temperature outside had dropped sharply with the storm. The cabin was cold. Hypothermia didn't care about anything except heat lost faster than the body could generate it. And they had both been in cold water. She understood what needed to happen. Harlan stood from the fire and looked at her. He understood it too. She could see it in his face, the brief, compressed conflict, and then the decision. He took off his heavy outer coat. It was soaked through and useless for warmth. He hung it over the cot frame and then reached up to the shelf and took down the wool blanket and held it out to her. Get out of the wet things, he said. His voice was even. The blanket's dry. He turned around. He faced the wall beside the fireplace, put his back to her, and stood there with his arms at his sides. She looked at his back. He had no dry blanket. He had no coat. He was soaking wet, and the cabin, while warming, was still cold enough that she could see his breath when he'd spoken. He was standing with his back to her in the growing firelight. Because he had made her a promise on day 3, and he was going to keep it even now, even here. She turned away and changed quickly, draping the wet dress and underthings over the cot frame beside his coat. The blanket was rough wool and scratchy, and the most welcome thing she had ever felt. She turned back. He was still facing the wall. His wet shirt was clinging to his back, and she could see him shivering. It was slight controlled, the way he controlled everything, but real. She looked at his back. She had spent 4 months being afraid of her uncle, afraid of the road, afraid of Thaddeus Montgomery's reach, afraid of men in general, and what they took when they decided they were allowed to. She had built walls with that fear, layer after layer of them, because walls were the only protection available to her. She looked at the man, standing with his back to her, shivering in wet clothes, refusing to turn around. She walked toward him. She pressed herself against his back and wrapped her arms around him and felt him go absolutely still. She was close enough to feel the shiver running through his back muscles, close enough to feel exactly how cold he was. She pressed her face against the wet fabric between his shoulder blades and held on. He didn't move. She tilted her face up, her breath warm against the back of his neck, and said quietly, "I'm soaking wet." She felt his breathing change. "Evie," he said. His voice was rough and very low. "You're cold," she said. "And so am I." She pressed closer. "And I'm not afraid. I want you to know that. I am choosing this. I am not afraid." A long silence. The fire cracked, and the rain hammered the roof, and the wind moved through the trees outside. He turned around slowly. He looked at her face for a long time, looking for fear, she realized. looking carefully, the way he looked at everything that mattered. He didn't find it. She reached up and put her hand against his scarred jaw, and he closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, they were different. The controlled, calculating stillness was still there, but underneath it was something raw and real and undefended. She had never seen him without the defense. She stood on her toes and kissed him. He was still for one more second, and then he was not still at all. He kissed her back like a man who had been waiting a long time and had stopped believing the wait would ever end. His hands, careful hands, deliberate, as everything else about him, came up to her face first, and then to her hair, and then pulled her in. Not rough, but absolute. The way a man holds something he has decided he is keeping. She kissed him like she meant it, because she did. She had spent a long time being handled, moved from place to place, managed, contained, sold or almost sold. She had forgotten what it felt like to reach for something because she wanted it, to make a choice from desire rather than desperation. She remembered now. The fire built behind them, and the cabin warmed, and the rain came down on the roof with a sound like applause, and whatever walls were left between them fell without drama, like they had never been necessary, like they had only ever been waiting for the right moment to be set aside. Afterward, they lay on the cot in the firelight, his ruined coat over them for warmth, his arm around her. The rain had gone from violent to steady. The worst of the storm had passed. She lay with her cheek against his chest and listened to his heartbeat slow down. He was tracing something on her shoulder with one finger. She didn't think he knew he was doing it. "Tell me about the scars," she said quietly. His hand stopped. Then it started again. "The slow tracing. The one on my face," he said. "I was 24. Man outside of Dodge City who decided my horse was his." I disagreed. He had a knife and a head start on the argument. He paused. I won the argument. "And the others?" "A silence. The ones on my back," he said, "are from before that." She waited. "I told you my father lost our land," he said. "What I didn't tell you was how. He had a partner, a man he trusted. They worked the land together for 3 years. The partner had debts my father didn't know about. Men came to collect those debts, and my father made the mistake of standing in the way." She felt his chest rise and fall. "They beat him badly enough that he didn't walk right after," Harlan said. "I was 16. I went after the men who did it. I was not 16 in any way that helped me against grown men." A pause. "I have 4 ribs that healed wrong. I still know which ones when the weather changes." She pressed her hand flat against his chest. "I left Tennessee after that," he said. "My father told me to. He said the land was gone and I needed to go somewhere I could build something that wouldn't be taken. He said to go somewhere nobody knew my name. Did he survive? He lived another 8 years," Harlan said. "He knew about this place. I wrote him when I bought the first parcel." He was quiet a moment. "He died knowing I had land with my name on the deed." She understood then, fully and completely. This ranch was a son keeping a promise to a father who'd had everything stripped from him. It was an act of love that had been extended over years and acres and hardship. He would have been proud, she said. Harlan was quiet. She felt the quality of the silence. "I think he was," he said. Finally, they were quiet together for a long while after that. The fire burned down, and he got up once to add a log and came back, and she settled against him again, like it was a thing they had always done. "Harlan," she said. The letters I sent," she said. "The marshal and the county registry. What about them?" "I sent a third letter," she said. 3 weeks ago. I didn't tell you." A pause. "Who to?" "A law firm in San Antonio," she said. "My father's former colleague. He specializes in land fraud and property cases." She kept her voice even. "I sent him copies of 4 documents from your box. Copies I made. The deed to the north parcel. The survey from the county. Montgomery's original purchase papers for the Reyes land, which I found in the county correspondence because it was referenced in a dispute letter, and a summary of the timeline of harassment against this ranch." The silence had a texture to it. "You made copies," he said. "Over 3 evenings," she said. "While you were doing the fence rounds." Another silence. "You didn't tell me. I wasn't sure you'd allow it," she said honestly. And I was fairly certain it was the right thing to do, so I did it. She felt his chest move. He made that sound, the one that wasn't quite a laugh. She was starting to love that sound. What did he say back? Harlan said. He said there are irregularities in Montgomery's title to the Reyes land, specifically around how the previous owner's signature appears on the transfer documents. She paused. He said it's worth investigating. Harlan was quiet. Montgomery is not just harassing ranchers, she said. He's building a case to challenge existing titles. He needs the land first and the legal argument second. The harassment is to make people leave voluntarily, so it doesn't look like coercion. I know, Harlan said, but now someone else knows it too, she said. Someone who knows what to look for. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You've been fighting this whole time." "Yes," she said, "in your own way. The only way I know," she said, "with paper and law and documentation. It's slower than a rifle, but it lasts longer." He pulled her closer, not dramatically, just tightening his arm around her. She lay in the cabin in the fading firelight and listened to the rain slow, and the night settle and thought about the fact that she had come to this place by accident and was here by choice. The distinction felt important. Outside, somewhere down the ridge, the river was still running high and fast. By morning, it would begin to drop. The cattle were safe in the south pen. Thomas and Luca and the others were back at the ranch, wet and tired and alive. For now, this cabin was enough. This warmth, this man, this fire. For now, this was the whole world. She slept. The rain had stopped by the time they came back down the ridge. The morning was cold and scrubbed clean, the way Texas mornings were after a hard storm, the sky a pale blue that looked freshly washed, the light sharp and clear, the air smelling of wet earth and cedar. It should have been beautiful. It was until they came around the eastern bend of the property and saw the smoke. Harlan stopped his horse. Evangeline stopped beside him. The main barn was still standing. The bunkhouse was still standing. The main house was still standing. But the feed storage building on the west side, the one they'd spent a week in August reinforcing the roof of, the one that held 2 months of grain and hay reserves, was a black and smoking ruin. They rode in at a canter. Thomas was standing in the yard watching the last of the smoke rise. He looked at Harlan when they rode up, and his face said everything before he opened his mouth. "They said it," Thomas said. "No lightning hits in that area last night." Luca found 2 burn points, both low on the west wall. Separate starts. It was deliberate. Harlan swung down from his horse and stood looking at the ruin. Evangeline dismounted beside him. She did the accounting in her head, 2 months of reserves gone. The cattle could graze through the fall, if the weather held, but the winter would be critical. They would need to purchase supplies at market prices, and the timing, with money already tight from the harassment campaign, was not accidental. "Rosa," Harlan said. Rosa had come to the yard. "Everyone's safe," Rosa said immediately. "All of us." "Where's Cody?" he said. A silence. She looked at Rosa. Rosa's face had changed. A small, precise shift around the eyes. "Where is Cody?" Harlan said again. Thomas said, "That's the other thing." He held out a folded piece of paper. Harlan took it. He read it. She watched his face as he read it. She had seen Harlan Caldwell through a thunderstorm and a stampede and a flood, and she had never seen his face do what it did while he read that piece of paper. He went very still. Then a muscle in his jaw moved. Then the stillness became something else, something that ran too deep and too cold for anger. He held the paper out to her. She took it and read. The handwriting was educated and deliberate. It identified Cody correctly, fully by his given name. Cody Half Moon, which was not a name she had ever heard Harlan use, because he simply called the boy Cody as a guest of Thaddeus Montgomery. It stated that Cody was in good health and would remain so as long as Mr. Harlan Caldwell was prepared to be reasonable. Being reasonable meant presenting oneself at the Montgomery Land Office in Onyx Ridge by noon the following day with the signed deeds to the North and Creek parcels of the Caldwell property and the woman currently residing at said property. She read it twice. She folded it and put it in her pocket. When she looked up, Harlan was walking toward the house. She followed him. He was at the gun rack in the front room. He was loading the revolvers, both of them, moving with a focused, precise speed that was different from his usual deliberate efficiency. This was colder and narrower and aimed at a single point. Harlan, she said. He kept loading. Harlan. She put herself in his line of sight. Not between him and the door. She was not going to stand between this man and anything just in his line of sight. He looked at her. Stop, she said. He has Cody, he said. His voice was flat and very quiet. It was the quietest she had ever heard him speak. I know, she said. And riding into Onyx Ridge in this state to drag Cody out of Montgomery's hands will get Cody killed before you reach the door. You know that. His jaw was tight. The revolvers were in his hands. Give me until this evening, she said. This evening. And then we do this my way first, and your way as the backup plan. This is not a legal problem, he said. Part of it is, she said. And the part of it that isn't, you'll still get to handle that part. I'm not asking you to stand down. I'm asking you to wait 6 hours. He looked at her for a long moment. The revolvers were still in his hands. She held his eyes and waited. She had learned, over weeks, that Harlan Caldwell listened to arguments that made sense. The anger in him right now was real and legitimate, and she honored it. She felt it herself. A fierce and focused outrage that Cody, who was 16, and split wood and chewed dried grass, and had tried to join the night watch with the hopeful determination of a boy who wanted to be taken seriously, that this boy was being used. That was monstrous, and she knew it. But she also knew what happened when a man like Harlan Caldwell walked into a room like the one Montgomery was sitting in right now. Montgomery had planned for that. He was counting on that. He wants you angry, she said quietly. He's been trying to make you angry for weeks. Every wire cut, and every dead steer, and every poisoned trough was designed to make you reach for those revolvers and do something that gives him a reason to have you removed, legally or otherwise. Harlan's hands were still. 6 hours, she said again. A long, airless silence. He set the revolvers on the table. Not away, on the table where he could reach them. 6 hours, he said. She went to the desk. She had the leather folio out in 1 minute. It had been under the floorboard beneath the desk. For 3 weeks, her idea. Harlan's agreement, because whatever happened to the house, the documents needed a chance of surviving. She opened it on the desk. Inside were copies of every deed, every survey, every piece of county correspondence, the 4 documents she had sent to San Antonio, with a copy retained. The letter back from the San Antonio firm, with its careful language about irregularities in Montgomery's title. The letters to the marshal and the county registry, with their dated postmarks. And 1 additional document, a notarized summary of the harassment timeline, that she had persuaded the traveling reverend to witness and stamp 3 weeks ago when he came through for Sunday service. Reverend Aldous Webb. She had asked him very politely if he would serve as a notary for a document concerning the rule of law and the protection of legal property rights, and he had said that he would be honored. Clerics, she had found, responded well to the framing of justice. She laid it all out on the desk and stood back and looked at it. Thomas had come to the doorway. Harlan stood beside the table with the revolvers on it. Luca and Burl were visible through the window, both standing in the yard waiting. Montgomery's plan is to use Cody to force a trade the deeds and me, she said. He thinks the deeds will give him legal possession, and I am some kind of bargaining chip with my uncle that has monetary value. She kept her voice businesslike. He is wrong on both counts. She looked at Harlan. These deed transfers would have to be registered with the county to be legally valid. A signature under duress, which this would be, is not legally binding. I know this because I read your law books, and I wrote to a lawyer to confirm it. Thomas made a sound of quiet approval. More importantly, she said, the U.S. Marshal in Reeves County received my letter 4 weeks ago. I sent a follow-up 2 weeks ago. I have not yet received a response, which tells me either the correspondence is being handled or it was intercepted. She touched the folio. This morning I am writing a 3rd letter, urgent, specific. It will name Thaddeus Montgomery by name. It will describe the kidnapping of a minor. And it will be dispatched by Cody's cousin Miguel, who I know lives in the South County, and who is, I believe, faster on horseback than anyone Montgomery has watching the roads. She looked at Burl. Burl straightened up involuntarily. Burl, she said, do you know the route to the South County? Yes, ma'am, he said from the window. Could you get a rider there safely? I could get there myself in 3 hours, he said. Then you're going, she said. As soon as I have the letter written, she sat down and picked up the pen. While I write this, she said, I need Thomas and Luca to ride to the 3 neighboring ranchers, the 2 who didn't sell. I need them to explain what happened last night and this morning. I need them to know that if Montgomery takes this ranch, they are next. I need them to understand that their testimony about their own harassment, added to our documentation, builds a case that a federal court takes seriously. Thomas nodded once. He went to get his hat. Harlan, she said. She was already writing. Yes, he said. You're going to ride into Onyx Ridge tomorrow with your men, she said, not looking up from the page. You're going to get Cody out of wherever they're holding him. I believe that is necessary, and I believe you are the right person to handle it. A pause, but you're going to ride in as the legal owner of documented property, she said, who has already been in correspondence with federal law enforcement, whose documentation of criminal harassment is dated and notarized and sitting in the hands of a San Antonio law firm. You are not riding in as a man who lost his temper. She looked up at him. When you walk into that room, she said, Montgomery should already know he's lost. What happens next is just him finding out. The room was quiet. Harlan picked up the revolvers from the table. He looked at them for a moment and then holstered them calmly, deliberately, back in their proper place rather than loose in his hands. Write the letter, he said. She wrote. It took her 40 minutes to write it well. She wrote 2 drafts. The first one too long and too emotional, which she recognized and discarded. The second one was 1 page, clear, numbered, specific, date, location names, sequence of events, culminating in the kidnapping of one Cody Halfmoon, a minor age 16. She used language she had taken directly from the law references on the shelf and from the San Antonio lawyer's letter. She made it easy to act on. She sealed it with wax and pressed Harlan's ring into it and handed it to Burl. Burl took it with both hands, which she noted, and went to get his horse. Harlan watched him go and then looked at the folio on the desk. You've been building this for weeks, he said. Since the second fence was cut, she said. Yes. He sat down in the chair across from the desk. He looked at her the way he had looked at that fence post on the first day measuring distance, accounting for variables. My father would have liked you, he said. She met his eyes. I hope so. He picked up the top document from the folio and read it carefully. Then the next one. She watched him work through the stack with the same methodical attention he gave to everything, checking her math. Essentially, she didn't mind. It was the right thing to do. After a while, he set the last document down. It's solid, he said. I know, she said. He looked at her for a moment, and in the clean, cold light of the morning after the storm, she could see clearly what had shifted between them. There was no careful distance anymore. There was just presence, his and hers, in the same room, pulling in the same direction. Tonight, he said, we go over the layout of Onyx Ridge. Every building, every exit, every place Montgomery's men might be positioned. I have a sketch, she said. I drew it from memory last week. She found it in the folio. She handed it across the desk. He looked at it. He looked at her. Of course you do, he said. He bent over the sketch, and she pulled her chair around to his side of the desk, and they put their heads together over the map of the town where tomorrow, one way or another, this was going to be finished. Outside the window, the smoke from the ruined barn had gone thin and pale, and the Texas sky was clear and hard and blue, and the road south was carrying Burl, and a letter that was about to change everything. Cody was going to come home. Evangeline was going to make sure of it. They rode out at first light, 7 of them. Harlan at the front, hat pulled low, revolvers on his hips. Winchester across the saddle horn. Thomas on his left, Luca on his right. Burl and Pete behind them. Two of the neighboring ranchers, Garrett Webb and old Jonas Pruitt, had ridden in the night before after Thomas delivered the message, and they rode at the back now, quiet and resolved. Evangeline rode with them. Harlan had not told her not to. He had looked at her the night before when they were going over the town sketch, looked at the leather folio in her hands, and said only, "Stay behind the riders until the marshal is confirmed inside." She had agreed to that without argument, because it was tactically correct. She wore the work clothes. The carbine was in the saddle scabbard. The folio was in the saddlebag, wrapped in oilskin. The road to Onyx Ridge was 8 miles, and they rode it mostly in silence. The morning was pale and cool, the light coming in flat from the east. The land on both sides still wet from the storm. Puddles stood in the wheel ruts. Birds were loud in the mesquite. It would have been a pleasant morning under different circumstances. She ran through the plan one more time in her head. Burl had reached Miguel Half Moon in the South County the previous afternoon. Miguel had ridden through the night to the Reeves County Marshal's office, arriving before dawn. He had not come back yet, which could mean the marshal was already moving, or could mean the letter had not found the right hands. They were operating on the assumption that it had. The timing was tight, and they were riding into it anyway, because Cody had been held one night already, and Harlan had given her 6 hours, and then waited the full night beyond that, and that was the end of his waiting. The first buildings of Onyx Ridge appeared at the head of the road. Harlan did not slow down. They came into the main street at a walk, which was more controlled and more deliberate than a gallop, and more intimidating than either, and the town noticed them. A man sweeping the steps of the dry goods store stopped sweeping. 2 women on the far boardwalk moved back toward the wall. A boy of about 8 appeared in a window and disappeared again. Montgomery's men were easy to spot. There were 4 of them visible, 2 near the land office, 1 outside the saloon, 1 at the far end of the street, pretending to adjust his horse's bridle. All of them had the same quality of stillness. All of them were watching the riders coming down the center of the street. The man in the black vest was near the land office. Angeline kept her eyes moving and her hands easy on the reins. Harlan stopped his horse in front of the land office and swung down. The others held position. She stayed behind, one hand on the folio in the saddlebag. The 2 men near the land office door shifted their weight. "I'm here about my property," Harlan said. His voice carried the full length of the street, not raised, just clear, and about a 16-year-old boy who was taken from it last night. Silence. The land office door opened. Thaddeus Montgomery came out. She had not seen him before. He was not what she had imagined. He was well-dressed, clean-shaved, with silver at his temples, and a face that had learned to look reasonable. He was maybe 50, with the build of a man who had once been physically formidable and was now carried by his position instead. He looked at Harlan. He looked at the 7 riders. He looked at Garrett Webb and old Jonas Pruitt at the back, and something recalculated behind his eyes. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "I hoped we could resolve this civilly." "Cody Half Moon," Harlan said. "Where is he?" "The boy is fine," Montgomery said. "He'll remain fine as soon as we conclude our business." "Your business," Harlan said, "is finished." Montgomery's expression shifted. "Not much," a tightening around the eyes. "You're making a mistake." "I don't think so," Harlan said. "I think you made one." Then everything happened at once. The man near the saloon drew first. He was fast, genuinely fast, and the shot went wide, because Thomas was faster from the saddle than anyone had the right to be. And the crack of Thomas's rifle sent the man spinning back against the saloon wall. Not dead, shoulder. Thomas was specific about where he put bullets. The 2 men at the door went for their guns. Luca and Burl were already moving, riding wide to either side to pull the angle of fire away from the group. Pete caught a graze across the upper arm and cursed loudly and kept riding. Harlan did not draw. He walked forward. Montgomery took 1 step back and reached inside his coat, and Harlan covered the ground between them in 3 strides and took hold of Montgomery's wrist. Before the pistol cleared the coat, he held that wrist with 1 hand, and with the other, he took the pistol and put it in his own belt. "Where is the boy?" he said, quiet, final. Montgomery's face had changed. The reasonable look was gone. "Storage room," he said, "behind the office." The shooting had gone ragged and then stopped. The man in the black vest had run. She watched him go, turning his horse hard down the alley, between the saloon and the barber shop, and disappearing north. The other two were on the ground, disarmed, Burl and Garrett Webb standing over them. Evangeline was already off her horse. She went around the side of the land office. There was a low building attached at the back, more of a large shed, with a padlocked door. She looked at the padlock and turned around, and Luca was right behind her with the butt of his rifle, and the lock came off in 2 strikes. She pulled the door open. Cody was inside, sitting against the back wall with his hands bound and a cut above his eye that had bled and dried. When the light came in, he squinted and then saw her, and his face did something complicated, relief and embarrassment, and a 16-year-old's very determined effort not to show either. "You took your time," he said. "We were thorough," she said, and went in and worked on the rope at his wrists. He winced when his hands came free, and she looked at his wrists, rope burned, but not broken. The cut above his eye needed cleaning. She ran her hands over his arms and checked his ribs. He flinched on the left side. "Bruised," she said. "Not broken. You're going to be sore for a week." "Did you get them?" he said. "We got them," she said. She got him up and walked him around to the front of the building. The street had settled into the aftermath of things. 3 men were down, none dead. 2 were sitting in the dirt, with their hands behind their heads. Garrett Webb watching them, with the patience of a man who had been waiting a long time for this particular moment. Montgomery was standing with Harlan's hand on his collar, the reasonable look entirely gone now, replaced by something that was mostly calculation about what options remained. The answer to that came from the south end of the street. 3 riders with marshal stars on their vests came in at a canter and pulled up in the center of the street. The man in front was maybe 45, lean, with a face that had been doing this job a long time, and was not surprised by any arrangement of people it found. He looked at the scene. He looked at Harlan. He looked at Montgomery. "Marshal Deakins," Harlan said. "Thank you for the prompt response. Got a very well-written letter," Deakins said. He looked at Evangeline, who had come around the corner of the land office with Cody. His gaze went to the folio she had picked up from where she'd left it against the hitching post. "That yours?" "Yes, sir," she said. "You the one who wrote to us?" "3 times," she said. He made a small sound, something between approval and amusement. He swung down from his horse and held out his hand, and she gave him the folio. He opened it where he stood and looked through the top 4 pages with the focused speed of a man who read official documents the way other people read newspapers. He looked at Montgomery. "Thaddeus Montgomery," he said. "I've been wanting to have a conversation with you about some land title irregularities in this county for about 6 months." Montgomery opened his mouth. "I'd save that for your lawyer," Deakins said, and nodded to his deputies. She stood on the main street of Onyx Ridge, with Cody beside her, and watched Thaddeus Montgomery be walked to the marshal's horse, with his hands bound behind him. He looked back once at Harlan, and his face was not afraid. It was furious, the fury of a man who had built something and watched it come apart and could not identify the exact moment it had gone wrong. She could have told him. It had gone wrong 3 times. The first letter, the second, the third. It had gone wrong every time he underestimated what a woman with books and a pen could do to a man with money and connections. She looked at Harlan. He was looking at her. He crossed the street and stopped in front of her and looked at Cody's eye, and then at her face, and then at the folio in her hand. "Good," he said. She nodded. Cody looked between them and said, "Are you 2 going to say more than 1 word to each other?" "Later," Harlan said, and put his hand briefly on the back of Cody's neck, the way a man does with a boy he is genuinely relieved to see standing upright. And Cody ducked away from it and pretended to be annoyed, and was very clearly not annoyed at all. Around them, Onyx Ridge was coming back to life. People had emerged from the buildings. The boy in the window had come outside. The women on the boardwalk were talking quietly. The man who had been sweeping the steps had come all the way to the edge of the boardwalk and was looking at Harlan Caldwell standing in the middle of the street with a directness that was different from how the town had been looking at him before. Respect, Evangeline thought, has a particular weight when it's new. People carry it carefully. They rode back to the ranch in the late morning. Behind them, Montgomery's land office was already in the marshal's custody. The documents inside it would answer a lot of questions. She suspected they would answer questions about her uncle as well. And that thought sat quietly in her as they rode, neither heavy nor particularly satisfying, just resolved. Like a long equation, finally balanced. The promised land appeared ahead, and even with the ruined west buildings still smelling of ash, it looked like what it was. Home. The bullet had caught him in the shoulder. She didn't know until they were back at the ranch and Rosa saw him dismount and come to him with her hands out. And he said, "It's fine." Rosa, which it was not. Evangeline was the one who found it. He was sitting at the kitchen table, and she pulled his shirt aside and looked at the wound and said, "It's a graze, deep one." She pressed around the edges, and he held still in the way. He held still for everything completely, deliberately. "It needs to be cleaned and closed. Then clean it," he said. She did. She worked at the kitchen table in the afternoon light with her carbolic and her needle and her clean cotton. And Rosa boiled water and brought it without being asked. Thomas sat in the doorway for a while, not because he was needed, just present. Cody sat at the far end of the table with a cold cloth on his eye, pretending to whittle something. Harlan didn't make a sound when the carbolic went on. He made a sound on the third stitch. She looked up. "Do you need a moment?" she said. He said, "4 more," she said. He nodded and looked at the wall, and she finished the stitching with clean, tight passes that her mother would have approved of. She tied it off and wrapped the shoulder in cotton and sat back. Cody was looking at Harlan from the end of the table with an expression of tremendous concentration. "Does it hurt?" Cody said. "Yes," Harlan said. Cody looked satisfied, like he'd been waiting to hear the man admit something was hard. He went back to his whittling. She was cleaning her instruments when she heard it. She wasn't sure at first what it was. She turned around. Harlan was sitting at the kitchen table, with his hands flat on the wood and his head bowed, and there was something on his face that she had never seen. A single line of moisture tracking down from his left eye through the scar, catching the afternoon light. She put down the cloth. She came back to the table and sat across from him and waited. He didn't look up for a long moment. Then he said, very low, "I've been doing this alone for 9 years." She didn't say anything. "I built every piece of this place with the understanding that I was going to do it alone." His voice was steady, but stripped of the usual control. The way a board is stripped of paint, the thing underneath was sound, just exposed. "I had it worked out. I had it settled in my head." She waited. "And then you got in the wrong wagon," he said. She heard something in that, the smallest roughness at the edge of the words. "I didn't plan on you," he said. "I didn't plan on any of it. I didn't plan on caring whether someone was cold, or whether someone was scared, or whether someone came back out of a river." He looked up. His eyes were dark and direct, and she met them without looking away. "I'm not good at this," he said, "at whatever this is." "You're better than you think," she said. "I nearly got you killed," he said. "I nearly got myself killed," she said. "I stepped on wet riverbank in the dark. That was my mistake." She folded her hands on the table. "And you came in after me." "Of course I did," he said, like there was no other possibility, like the alternative had never formed in his mind. She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was warm in the kitchen. Somewhere outside, Thomas was talking to Luca about the feed situation, and the practical business of the ranch was already resuming around them, because ranches didn't pause for sentiment. "Harlan," she said, "I came here by accident. I stayed by choice." She held his eyes. "I'm still choosing." He looked at his hands on the table. "I don't know what I have to offer you," he said. "This?" she said simply. "Exactly this. The ranch, the work, the people, the purpose." She paused. "You." The kitchen was quiet. Rosa had gone outside. Cody had gotten very interested in something outside the window, the whittling forgotten. "My uncle will come eventually," she said, "when Montgomery's dealings are exposed. There'll be enough to implicate him, too. The marshal will want to talk to me." "Let him come," Harlan said. "It could be complicated," she said. "Legally, for a while. We have a lawyer in San Antonio," he said. She looked at him. "Apparently," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly. Something quieter and more permanent than a smile. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over under hers and held on. The days that followed were the slow work of putting things right. The burned building was cleared and the good timber salvaged and stacked. Thomas organized the work parties with his usual efficiency, and Burl worked alongside Luca without comment, passing boards and driving nails in a silence that had become companionable rather than hostile. She noticed it and said nothing about it. Some changes announced themselves, and some just quietly became true. Marshal Deakins returned to the ranch 4 days after the confrontation in Onyx Ridge. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of Rose's coffee and went through the folio document by document, asking careful questions and writing the answers in a small notebook. He confirmed that Montgomery's titles to the Reyes and Hutchins properties had been obtained through fraudulent means, forged signatures, exactly as the San Antonio lawyer had suspected. Both properties would revert to proper process. He also confirmed that correspondence found in Montgomery's office connected a man named Gerald Sterling of Boston to the broader scheme. Evangeline sat with her hands in her lap and received that news with a steadiness that surprised even her. "He'll be charged," she said. "Conspiracy to defraud and, we believe, trafficking," Deakins said. "Yes," she nodded. "Will you need me to testify?" "Almost certainly," he said. "I'll be available," she said. Deakins looked at her with the expression she was becoming familiar with, the look of someone revising their initial assessment, significantly upward. Two neighboring ranchers who hadn't sold came to the ranch that Sunday. Garrett Webb brought his wife and 3 children. Jonas Pruitt brought a pie, which he presented to Rosa, with the solemnity of a man making an offering at a temple. They ate in the yard, because the table inside wasn't large enough, and Harlan sat at the end of the long boards they'd laid over, saw horses, and watched his diverse, improbable, real community eat together in the sunshine. He looked at Evangeline across the table. She looked back. The town of Onyx Ridge was shifting, slowly the way large things shift, not a sudden turn, but a gradual change in weight and balance. The men who had turned away from Harlan Caldwell on the street for 9 years didn't suddenly become warm, but the turning away stopped. A few of them looked him in the eye now when he rode through. The barber nodded. The dry goods man asked about the fence repairs with what appeared to be genuine concern. Prejudice, she understood, was not a wall that fell all at once. It was more like a long frost. It thawed at the edges first, in small patches, and then more. And then one day you looked, and the ground was soft again. You could plant things in soft ground. She went to see Thomas the evening after Marshal Deakins left. He was sitting on the bunkhouse porch with his pipe. "Thank you," she said, "for the shot in Onyx Ridge, the one that went to the shoulder." Thomas looked at her steadily. "You know why I aimed there and not center mass. Because a dead man is a problem for a court," she said. "And you understood that." He nodded. "I've been understanding that for a long time." He pulled on the pipe. "Doesn't always pay off. This time it did." She sat in the chair across from him. "Will you stay?" she said. "At the ranch, after all this." He looked out at the dark yard for a moment, at the new timber stacked by the ruined building, at the lights in the main house windows. "I've been here 6 years," he said. "This is the first place I've worked where my opinion about a fence line is asked and actually heard." He tapped out the pipe. "I'll stay." She went back to the main house. Harlan was on the porch with his coffee, his arm in the sling she'd made him promise to wear for at least another week. He looked up when she came up the steps. She sat in the chair beside him and looked out at the dark land. Stars over Texas were relentless. There was simply no shortage of them. They covered the whole sky from edge to edge, and they were so bright and so numerous that they looked impractical, like the sky was showing off. She leaned her head against his good shoulder. His arm came around her. They sat there in the quiet and watched the stars, and the ranch breathed around them in the dark, alive and intact in theirs. Spring came to the promised land, the way good things come to people who have earned them. Not fast, not dramatic, just present one morning in a way it hadn't been the morning before. The mesquite leafed out pale green overnight. The garden behind the house showed its first rows of dark sprouts, pushing through the soil. Rosa had been working since February. The creek was running clean and clear, and the cattle in the south pasture were fat and moving slow the way cattle move when they have no complaints. The new building stood where the old feed store had burned, sturdier than the one before, built with good timber and better joinery. Burl having turned out to be a more skilled carpenter than any of them had known, because nobody had thought to ask. It had a wide overhang on the south side that kept the morning shade until 10 o'clock, and it smelled, on warm days, of new wood and dried grass, and something that was just the particular scent of a place that had been rebuilt by people who meant it. Evangeline had claimed the porch, not the main house porch, the wide south-facing boards under the overhang of the new building, where the morning light fell at exactly the right angle, and where you could see both the road and the garden and the far ridge all at once. She had put a table there, a real one, solid, that Harlan had made over 3 evenings in the barn without telling her why. He carried it out one morning while she was in the kitchen and set it on the porch and put 4 chairs around it and left for the fence line before she could say anything about it. She ran her hand along the surface. Smooth work, careful joins. The table became the schoolroom. It started with Rosa. She had been teaching Rosa to read for months, working through the evenings after supper, starting with the basics and moving steadily forward. Rosa approaching it with the same methodical determination she brought to everything. By February, Rosa was working through the law reference books on the shelf, which she said were tedious but thorough, which Evangeline agreed was accurate. Then, Luca's younger sister came to stay for a month, and she was 12 and curious, and Rosa told her to sit at the porch table on Tuesday morning, which the girl did. And Evangeline came out and found her sitting there and began. Then Cody decided he wanted to improve his arithmetic and arrived on Thursday. Then 2 of the children from the Webb Ranch up the road started appearing on Monday and Wednesday mornings because Garrett Webb rode over one afternoon and had a conversation with Evangeline and Harlan on the porch that lasted an hour and ended with him shaking both their hands. Then old Jonas Pruitt's granddaughter came. She was 7 and had red hair and was missing 2 front teeth and had opinions about everything. And she became, within a week, Evangeline's favorite student and most exhausting responsibility. On a Tuesday in April, Evangeline stood at the porch table and looked at 6 children sitting in the chairs and on the extra bench Thomas had built, and on a stool someone had brought from the barn. White children, a native girl, Cody, who was mixed and 16, and pretending this was beneath him while clearly paying close attention. Jonas's granddaughter, with her missing teeth and her hand constantly in the air. They were learning to read. She read to them first, always before they worked on their letters. She read them history and stories, and once she read them a passage from the land law books that described how property rights worked in the United States, how deeds functioned, how a court determined legitimate title. And the children listened, because she made it interesting, and because they were at an age where justice felt like an urgent and personal matter. Why does a piece of paper mean you own land? Jonas's granddaughter asked. Her name was Pearl, and she asked approximately 40 questions per session. That's a very good question, Evangeline said. What do you think should determine it? Pearl thought hard. Whether you take care of it, she said. That's one argument, Evangeline said. What do other people think? They discussed it for 20 minutes. 6 children and a teacher on a ranch porch in the Texas spring, working out the relationship between law and justice and what it meant to belong to a place. She thought her mother would have been very pleased. The marshal's case against Montgomery concluded in March. The trial was in San Antonio, and she testified for 2 days, clearly and without decoration, laying out the documented timeline and her role in compiling it. The San Antonio lawyer sat beside her at the plaintiff's table and was quietly excellent. Gerald Sterling, her uncle, was tried separately and convicted in April on charges of conspiracy and trafficking. She received the letter about the verdict on a Wednesday and read it twice, and then folded it and put it in the stove. She stood at the stove for a moment with her hands at her sides. Harlan came in from the yard and looked at her, she told him. He was quiet a moment. He crossed the kitchen and put both arms around her, carefully, because the shoulder was healed, but she was always careful with it anyway. And he held on. She let him. It wasn't grief. Exactly. It was more like the end of a long, sustained tension, like a wire that had been pulled taut for years, finally going slack. She stood in his arms in the kitchen and felt the slackening of it, and it was neither happy nor sad. It was just over. It's done, she said. It's done, he said. The evening in spring came slow and golden. Harlan came out of the barn in the late afternoon with the smell of horse and good work on him, and found her on the porch with the children's lesson papers stacked on the table, grading them with the focused pleasure of a person doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. He came and stood behind her and looked over her shoulder at Pearl's paper, which had a drawing in the margin of what appeared to be a horse wearing a hat. "Is that a teaching tool?" he said. "She's expressing herself," Evangeline said. "She drew a hat on the horse," he said. "She has vision," Evangeline said. He moved her hair aside and pressed his lips briefly to the back of her neck, and she tilted her head back against him. The land spread out before them in every direction, the greening pastures, the dark line of the creek, the ridge going gold in the late light, the wide Texas sky doing its evening thing with color, extravagant and unashamed. Thomas was coming in from the far pasture on his horse, moving easy. Luca was at the pump. Rosa appeared in the kitchen window and disappeared again. Cody was attempting to teach Jonas's granddaughter Pearl how to throw a rope properly, and Pearl was throwing it at everything except the post. Harlan wrapped his arms around Evangeline from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder. She laced her fingers through his. His hands were calloused and scarred and completely familiar to her now. She knew the specific weight of them, and the warmth and the deliberateness with which they moved through the world. "We weren't born from this soil," she said. He was quiet, listening. "We came from somewhere else," she said. "Both of us. We came broken, in different ways." She looked out at the land. "But we stayed, and we built something here, and we fought for it, and we let people in who needed it." She held his hands tighter. "That's what makes a place yours. It's not the deed, though the deed matters. It's the choice you make every day to tend it." He turned his face toward her temple. "Compassion," he said quietly. "Respect. Courage." She smiled. "You were listening." "I'm always listening," he said. "I just don't talk as much as you." Pearl let out a shriek of triumph. She had gotten the rope around the post, possibly by accident, and Cody made a skeptical sound that Pearl loudly contested. And Rosa called from inside that supper was in 20 minutes. And anyone not washed up didn't eat, a rule she enforced with absolute consistency. The promised land moved into its evening. The children's voices carried across the yard. The last light ran gold over the mesquite and the new timber of the rebuilt barn and the long grass along the creek. The sky went from gold to rose to a deep, clear blue at the eastern edge, where the stars were already beginning. They stood on the porch together in the last of the light. They had planted roots, both of them, not because this soil had claimed them at birth, not because they had been given it or inherited it or stumbled into it without cost. They had planted roots here because they had chosen to, and because they had bled for it and fought for it and let it mean something, and because the people standing in the yard below them had done the same. Roots planted by choice go deeper than the ones you're born with. She believed that. Looking at this land, at this life, at the man whose chin rested warm on her shoulder and whose hands were laced through hers, She had never believed anything more completely in her life. The stars came out over Texas, all of them at once, relentless and bright. The promised land held, and so beneath the endless Texas sky, the promised land became more than a ranch, more than a collection of fences, buildings, cattle, and legal deeds. It became proof that a true home is not always the place where we are born. Sometimes, home is the place we find after we have lost everything else. Evangeline arrived in Onyx Ridge because she climbed onto the wrong wagon while running for her life. She believed she was making another desperate escape. But that mistake carried her toward the first place where she was treated not as property, not as a burden, and not as a helpless woman waiting to be rescued, but as a human being whose mind, courage, and choices mattered. Her journey reminds us that the wrong road can sometimes lead us to the right life. There are moments when our plans collapse, when the future becomes uncertain, and when all we can see ahead is fear. Yet those moments are not always the end of our story. Sometimes they are the first steps toward the life we were always meant to build. Harlan Caldwell also teaches us something important about real strength. He was a man capable of violence, but violence was never what made him powerful. His strength was revealed in the way he protected a frightened boy, welcomed people others rejected, shared his table with every person who had earned a place there, and kept his word even when no one was watching. Harlan understood that power should not be used to control the weak. It should be used to make room for them to stand. A person's character is not measured by how loudly they speak or how many people fear them. It is measured by what they do when they have the power to take advantage of someone and choose instead to show mercy, dignity, and respect. At the same time, Evangeline proved that courage does not always carry a rifle. Sometimes, courage carries a pen. She did not defeat Montgomery through brute strength alone. She fought him with careful records, legal knowledge, patience, and truth, while the enemy expected Harlan to lose his temper and walk into a trap. Evangeline quietly built a case strong enough to bring the law to their side. Her victory reminds us never to underestimate intelligence, preparation, or the quiet work done behind closed doors. The world often celebrates dramatic acts of bravery, but many of life's greatest victories are won through small, disciplined choices made day after day. A letter written carefully, a document preserved, a lesson taught, or a wounded hand treated with kindness may seem insignificant in the moment. But those small actions can change the direction of an entire community. This story also shows us that love is not possession. Evangeline had spent much of her life surrounded by men who believed that money, bloodlines, or social position gave them the right to decide her future. Harlan was different because he never demanded her trust. He earned it. He gave her space, respected her boundaries, taught her how to protect herself, and allowed her to choose whether she stayed or left. Their love became powerful because it was built on freedom. She did not stay because she had nowhere else to go. She stayed because she chose him, the ranch, the people, and the purpose they shared. That is one of the greatest lessons this story offers. True love does not trap us. It helps us become more fully ourselves. It does not ask one person to become smaller so the other can feel strong. It gives both people the courage to stand taller. The Promised Land also became a symbol of what a community can be when people judge one another by their actions instead of their race, their past, or the assumptions others have made about them. Harlan's table welcomed those who worked, sacrificed, and stood beside one another. Thomas, Luca, Rosa, Cody, Burl, and the others were not bound together because they came from the same place. They were bound together because they chose loyalty over prejudice and shared responsibility over selfishness. Their community was not perfect, and change did not happen overnight. But every time someone was treated with dignity, another piece of the old hatred began to weaken. The story reminds us that prejudice rarely disappears through speeches alone. It changes when people work together, defend one another, share meals, listen, and finally recognize the humanity they had once refused to see. Perhaps the deepest message of Evangeline and Harlan's journey is that we are not defined by what was done to us. Harlan was not only the boy whose family lost its land. Evangeline was not only the woman her uncle tried to sell. Thomas was not defined by the people who underestimated him. Cody was not defined by the men who used him as leverage. Each of them chose what came next. Their wounds remained, but those wounds did not become their destiny. They turned pain into protection, fear into preparation, and loneliness into belonging. In the end, the Promised Land held because it was defended by more than guns or laws. It was defended by compassion, courage, knowledge, loyalty, and the daily decision to care for something larger than oneself. That is how roots are truly planted. Not simply through birth, inheritance, or ownership, but through the choices we make every day, the people we protect, the truth we defend, the kindness we offer, and the home we build together. So as the stars rise over the Texas plains and Harlan and Evangeline stand side by side watching the life they created, we are left with one lasting truth. Sometimes the road we never planned to take leads us exactly where we belong. And sometimes the strongest roots are not the ones we are born with, but the ones we choose to plant. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.